Welcome to A Table in a Tavern, your community RPG podcast. Every episode, we'll explore the depth of immersive storytelling, character creation, and mechanics that make ttrpgs so captivating. Whether you're a dungeon master, a player, or just a curious listener, there's a seat for you at our table. So grab your ale, pull up a chair, and let's embark on this journey together. Welcome to the Tavern. Hello everybody, I am GM Keegan. With me as always we have DM Knock, and across the table, a longtime veteran GM, Malfane. Today we're covering playstyle simulation. We're going to go into that in a little detail. Maybe that's a breakdown at your table you've never heard of. Maybe that's a term you've never heard of. But it's okay. We're going to go step by step. What does it mean and how do you use it? First off, Mal, what's your interpretation of the word simulation as a playstyle?
The interpretation of the word simulation, it's basically quantifying what it is the players are mainly engaging. I thought the best way to get it across is to do it by example, because if I just explain it in like abstract terms, it's not going to map onto anything.
I think it's perfect because maybe it's a term that a lot of people just don't use.
I don't know what the hell you're talking about. Well, I know. Yeah, hi, I'm at the table too. I have no idea what this is. I feel like, Keegan, every time we have an episode, you guys blather some weird terminology. And I'm like, please define this. I am the black crayon in a colorful box of crayons.
All right. Well, playstyle is effectively to RPGs. I think the best analogy would be to think of it as genres of video game, or categories of video game, like first-person shooter or isometric turn-based RPG or what have you. Right? It's sort of qualifying like how you play the game, the kinds of challenges the game poses to you, but not much else. Like in the category of first-person shooter, you can have like a horror game with narrow corridors and flickering lights and jump scares, or it could be like an open-ended sandbox romp through the galaxy with zany characters and goofy comedy. Wildly different experiences, but both first-person shooters, because they're just looking at what is this kind of challenges it's posing to the player. Something about perspective, aiming correctly, moving, stuff like that. And so too with role-playing games that challenge the players, not their characters, but the players in different ways, that I would argue when it becomes mutually exclusive, constitute a new play style, right? Like you can't do both of them at the same time. You have to pick one, and so.
Okay, so we're going to bring in something that is not just how the characters interact with the world, but how the players are interacting with the game setting or RPGs in general. So this is like across the table, in-game, out-of-game.
The challenge it poses to them more specifically, I think, is more accurate, because you can imagine players being interested in all sorts of facets of the game that isn't necessarily a challenge, enjoyable and all the same, but the challenge portion is what I think constitutes the playstyle.
I was gonna say right now that I think people could easily get the idea of, well, this sounds just typical challenge. Oh, you mean like gritty or hardcore, or it's a lethal system because the NPCs and monsters do X amount of damage. Okay, that's fine. Or there's no death saves, which is very typical in a D&D style game. So is that the kind of challenge, or is there something more to it?
Well, I thought the best way to demonstrate would be to design an adventure in a very familiar playstyle, and then design the same adventure in the simulationist playstyle to show how it differs.
Perfect.
So,
give us an example, then we'll all chew on it.
All right. Well, let's do the familiar playstyle that I like to call gamist playstyle. That should be familiar to most people, if not everyone in the hobby. There is a MacGuffin. There is a mountain surrounded by forest that stretches halfway up the mountain and then gives way to the rocky terrain that makes up the rest. And there's a cave there. MacGuffin is inside that cave. Now, normally there'd be a whole series of obstacles and enemies and things in the path of you and the MacGuffin, and that would constitute the adventure. But for the sake of brevity, we're going to collapse that down to a single opponent. There's an ogre between you and the MacGuffin inside that cave.
God, not ogres.
How would that play? This should be a very familiar design. So the way you'd play this, because there's really nothing in their path until they get to the cave, the GM would describe their journey up the mountain through the forest until it gives way to the rocky terrain and they arrive at the entrance of the cave. You deal with the ogre in an epic battle, add the bells and whistles of environmental hazards, falling stalactites, earthquakes, what have you. After a harrowing battle with the ogre, ideally, the players emerge victorious, get the MacGuffin, and save the day. Basically, how you'd play that.
So we're playing D&D. Okay. I think
it should be very familiar.
I think everybody's played the D&D. Okay. Yes.
It's that same design I'm going to do in the simulationist playstyle. But I will note that serves as the very foundation of the simulationist playstyle, and that's footprints. So now you might be thinking, how are footprints the basis or the foundation of a whole playstyle? Well, let's add some, because everything else would be the same. Designed the same way, there'd be a MacGuffin, there'd be an ogre, there'd be forest, and all that stuff. All of it would be the same, but I'm going to add footprints that leave evidence of its existence. And so before I can design those, I have to answer a few questions about this ogre. Like, what does it eat? Where does it sleep? What does it drink? Where does it poop? Things like that. As I answer these questions, I develop a daily routine for it, behaviors that it does, that gives me an indication of what kind of footprints it would leave. And so for the purposes of brevity, I'm just going to answer one of those. What does it eat? Well, there's a forest not far from where the cave is. We'll say deer. How does it hunt these deer? Does it run them down? It's not that fast. It's a lumbering ogre. It can't run them down, so it throws rocks at them, let's say. It's a mountain. It lives in a cave. Plenty of rocks for it to throw. Makes sense. Once I've done this, I would do the same thing you did in the other place. They describe their journey up the mountain. However, I would consider their encounter with the ogre to begin at the beginning of that ascent up the mountain. And the reason I'd consider that the beginning of the encounter would be because that's where they encountered the first footprints. In this case, most likely, the first thing they'll see is a rock with blood on it. Why? Because this ogre has thrown it at a deer, and one of them would have tumbled down the incline of the mountain and eventually ended up at the bottom. The next thing they're likely...
So just like we're carrying this along, is that right now you're building up what it appears to be just a very detailed environmental moment. Great setup.
You're turning the adventure into the Silmarillion.
Actually, no. So this serves as a foundation. So let me explain what's happening here. As they're making their way up the mountain, they're going to see this rock. The next thing they're going to see are like trees that have been shattered because the ogre misses sometimes, right, and hits a tree. And so they're going to see these things as they make their way up. They're going to find actual footprints, then drag marks behind those footprints as it drags the deer up to its cave. And eventually, because, when it eats the deer, it probably throws the bones outside because they don't want to deal with the creepy crawlies. When they get to the cave entrance, a pile of bones from deer. And you might be thinking, cool environmental storytelling and all, but this isn't really all that different, right?
Yeah, except this right now is like an exceptional, and I'm going to say D&D. I know you said it's not system specific, but majority of people are kind of used to this. Okay, this is a great adventure, and I bet you people's minds are already working. Their imaginations are growing of, oh, there's a rock with blood, there's deer, and like you could see this environment grow out of your descriptions, which is great. But is the simulation playstyle just better descriptions?
So far, it just seems like environmental storytelling, just flavor text to trekking up the mountain. So you might be thinking like, well, nothing's really changed. It's just environmental storytelling. They still have to go in there and fight the thing. Right? Like that's still what has to happen. Except no, if they can piece these clues together, they have enough information now that they actually don't have to go in the cave and fight the damn ogre. Couple of options, again, system aside, couple of options immediately open up. Why not Trojan horse this thing? Go hunt a deer yourself, poison the meat and leave it outside for the ogre to find. Next it gets, hungry, it steps outside and maybe it doesn't look a gift deer in the mouth and chomps down on it in its cave. Gets poisoned, dies. Congratulations, you defeated the ogre. Never had to fight it. You don't have poison, can't make one. Dig a hole, put spikes at the bottom, cover it up, and lure it into a trap. Congratulations, killed the ogre. No combat needed to happen.
So you're basically aiming for it to be cycling it back to the original adventure that you were describing. You're putting more information out for the players so that there's no longer just A or B, left or right. You're opening it up for imagination and more agency and more creativity to how to deal with things based off of basically Sherlock Holmesing their way up to it.
In a way, because one thing that changes once you add this element. So this is just this, again, it hasn't speciated into a different playstyle yet. These are compatible so far, right? But the next thing that happens if you're playing in a game where these are options, players can lure it into a trap so devious scheme can kill it without ever fighting it. Once that's an option, you got to ask yourself, what the hell even is a balanced encounter anymore? Right now, I could have this ogre be such a ferocious monster of an enemy that it could flatline any party member in a single hit, and 99 out of 100 times would TPK the entire lot, and I would still consider this an easy encounter. Because it's a dumb brute creature, and you can outsmart it real easy with the information you have, and so it's still relatively easy to overcome this obstacle, just not in a fight. And once I've changed that formula, what the hell even is a balanced encounter? Now it's a different playstyle. Now it needs to be clarified what kind of game we're playing. Because if you played it like at the D&D game that Keegan called it, the Game's playstyle, if you played it that way and you just bulldozed into the cave, you'd just get TPK'd and you'd call me out for being a terrible GM, right? And I would be because I didn't warn you. We're not playing that kind of game, right? Balanced encounters aren't the way that you're used to. Do you see how that and then once you change that formula, that changes how you design adventures, that changes how you design everything else, right? So it spirals from there. But already we have sort of graduated into a different playstyle just in this little segment, microcosm. Does that follow so far?
So is it just like because there's a big debate. There's been a lot of videos and blogs and forum discussions and arguments about balance, if it's a good thing or not. Some say don't ever balance. And if you still play D&D, just not balance encounters, won't you get the same effect? And if you get the same effect, won't it just be the same playstyle? Or is there still another layer?
D&D is just a system, which is what I'm putting that aside for a second. So if you
we'll call it the adventure system. So whatever you're playing, it's still an adventure, right?
Right. So you can have a game where you just upset the balanced encounter stuff. The problem with that is if you still behave the same way, right? There's no balanced encounters. It's just we're throwing that out. And players behave the same way that they usually do in a dungeon crawl or whatever, where they just kick down the door and start firing, right? Like if they're outgunned on the other side of that door, they just die. So like 2 adventures in, you're dead. Right? Because you didn't know what was on the other side. You kicked down the door, all guns blazing, and you were outgunned. Short adventure, short campaign. It doesn't function that way. You'd have to change how everyone behaves. And the way you change it, you start to graduate into the simulationist playstyle of, well, it's all about information gathering, right? Like you have to know what's on the other side of the door. You have to know how you can defeat that thing before you engage. Because if you just go in blind, it's not balanced, right? There's no GM meta balancing act happening here. So it becomes an information game, and the footprints that I mentioned serve as the foundation of that.
This sounds like advanced veteran player stuff. Like you wouldn't introduce a new tabletop role player into a system like this or into a play style like this, would you?
I think you could. Like in the example that I just gave of like going up the mountain, I think it's not too difficult, right? Like there's ways to make this more difficult, less difficult, and the way you think of it like you're creating a murder mystery or something, right?
Yeah.
You can, if you pepper in enough clues, it's really easy. Like anyone can do it, right? Like it's not that difficult. But you can also make it hidden, right? For example, let's say there's a buried, a long forgotten tomb of an ancient wizard that's been buried under the sands and dunes of the desert or whatever, and recently uncovered. You're not going to have footprints outside of that. It's been like eons since this thing was buried, right? But at that point, that is a veteran player kind of challenge, because then they have to proactively look for information instead of just observing it in the environment, as I did with the ogre scenario. The ogre scenario is relatively easy mode, because all of the information is there for you to find on your trek up the mountain, and it's very, very obvious clues. Shattered trees and giant boulders with blood on it, right? Like, this is not something you're going to miss. Whereas the old school, like, Death Trap dungeons, there was a reason players carried around the 10-foot poles to poke the ground and the ceiling to make sure the traps didn't get them, right? And
exactly. That's actually what I was thinking of. That's what I was thinking
that kind of proactive.
It's old.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Well, kind of.
It's old in the sense that the name is newer, I believe, but the style is one of the oldest styles, and it's the world is the world, and you're in it. What do you do in that world? The world isn't going to be shaped and catered and curated perfectly for you, and that's where terms like balance encounter comes up. But a lot of times, this is decades and decades old worth of playing, people will have like the world is the world. Now you can have advanced things like you mentioned before, or you can simplify it into an ogre that eats a deer, and you can find its dung droppings everywhere. But you could still have the same principles involved of the information gathering is just as important in the real world as it is in this game world.
Well, so I would say it's an evolution of that old school. So if we're going with the evolutionary terminology here, this is that old school playstyle split into two branches, right? One of them became the D&D gamey branch, and the other one became the simulationist branch. One of the things of the old Death Trap dungeons was you would have like a massive set of backup characters with you, because you just expect to die. There aren't clues. You're just going to have to trial and error your way to victory, and there's going to be a lot of deaths along the way. And that was sort of the meat grinder attitude back in the day. But the simulationist style actually suggests like, well, no, it doesn't have to be chance-based. You don't have to pay with your life for mistakes. If there's enough clues, if there are enough footprints, if there's an opportunity to get those footprints, you're still balancing encounters. You're making this challenge to the players rather than random deaths. It's a challenge that you can fail or succeed at, and so it isn't random anymore. There's a skill here that you can apply to succeed, right? So it's not that as random a death as it was in the old school. And then the other way you could go with the game style is you just have balanced encounters. You want that more high octane action to action sequences, and so you want them to kick down the door and just kick ass and take names, right? And so you balance the encounters to allow them to conduct that behavior and not TPK every 2 sessions, right?
Okay.
So those are the two branches that it path off to.
Okay. Yeah. And for you, Knock, like in the beginning, you were mentioning that you never heard this term, and it's wild, and I seem to be making up things each episode that we're going to discuss.
You do. It's a thing.
Now, the definitions and the words might be new or made up, but is anything about the discussion like familiar? Or do you use these? Do you use a portion of these, or is this just an alien concept for a lot of the games you kind of run?
Well, I don't think I'm the black crayon anymore. I think I'm like a dark green. But okay. I feel like I don't know how else to describe this other than so the idea behind it is you're giving information to the players. They should be able to absorb this information and overcome the obstacle set before them with this information. It's like you said, it's a skill set. But I feel like, from what I'm understanding, and again, I could be totally wrong with this, it almost seems like a metagame style play. And I say that because I'm only familiar with D&D. Yeah, whatever, judge me, I don't care. I'm only familiar with D&D. And with that said, a lot of these things, there's that tried and true thing, like my character would do that, or my character would not notice this. They might not make that connection. And so if we're strictly relying on feeding the info, with the purpose of them taking that info and being able to overcome this obstacle that should not be overcome any other way, or I don't want to say balance because we're trying to remove the whole balancing thing. Then to me, is that metagaming, or like where's the room for skill checks and stuff like that for the characters, not the players?
This is beautiful, because this goes into the naming convention that I have for these playstyles as well. So the reason I call the D&D playstyle that you're familiar with Gamist, the Gamist playstyle, is because if you pay attention to where the players are challenged, the players in that game, it's not when they're trekking up the mountain and the GM is giving them the sights, the sounds, the smells, and it's not where they come to the crossroads and just flip a coin, because there's two unknowns, there's no pro and con to consider or deliberate on. So it's when they encounter the ogre and combat starts. So whatever system you're deploying, probably D&D, right? You're rolling initiative, and so success and failure in terms of players is almost entirely a meta consideration, in that it's familiarity with the system, the stats in your character sheet, the strengths and weaknesses of your character, and the spell list or whatever else there might be, abilities that they have, and how to deploy those in the most optimal tactical way as a team in this fight against the ogre. right? It is that's being tested, that you can fail so as to TPK or succeed so as to trounce this thing in combat. There is this challenge to the player lies therein, right? And so it's utilizing those stats in their character sheets and their strengths and weaknesses, avoid their weaknesses, use their strengths, all that stuff. Therein lies their challenge. But if you were to look at the simulationist version of this, how are we challenging them there? Where's the challenge to them there? The challenge is in perceiving the world in a simulated fashion, like considering it a simulated world, such that when you see a boulder with blood on it, you don't think of it as flavor text. You don't think of it as mood setting or some other like foreshadowing or any other like meta consideration. You see it as the effect of a cause, because that's how things work. Causes have effects, and this isn't here because the GM thought it was cool. It's here because something caused it to be here. And if you think that way, you can piece these clues together into a full picture, and then again, just cause and effect sort of work your way to, well, I can trap it, right? Or I can poison it, and I can use this against it, this knowledge. And that's what you're rewarded for doing, is to think of it in that simulated world sort of way, instead of any sort of meta consideration. Obviously, if you make a character that's a dunce, it would be out of character. Yeah.
So game mastery is less important. Is that because if you have game mastery in the middle of a combat and understanding the weaknesses and pros and cons, the distance and how often you can use an action, etc., and having the understanding because you're an experienced player, having an understanding of, okay, I can do this, I can do X, Y, and Z in this system, and that is how I become proficient and can grow, and that's my challenge. Simulation just doesn't have game mastery in it, or it's just less of a consideration.
It's less of you touch base with it less. Consider that systems are designed to facilitate the playstyle, not the other way around. Obviously, for the individual GM, you're not designing your own system, you're just picking one up. Right? But generally, systems are designed to facilitate a playstyle. And if you were to design a system to facilitate the simulationist playstyle, what you would do is have it mirror what you'd expect to happen given the physics of the world. Right? So if I see a shattered tree as a consequence of being struck by a boulder thrown by this ogre, and that tree has been splintered, and the entire like the trunk of the tree has split in half, and I look at that and I go like, that I am way more squishy than that tree. If I get hit by one of these, I'd expect to be a Jackson Pollock painting against the forest backdrop, right? Like that's what I'd expect to happen. And so whatever the system rules are, sort of has to be in that category, right? Like because that's what you'd expect. And so if you don't know it specifically, like how many dice of damage does it do, it's still going to be enough to kill you. That should be your clue that you don't want to give this thing a chance to throw a punch at you, because it's going to turn you into a smear, right? And so it's less of a burden because it's, even if you don't know it, you can common sense your way to understanding like, this is to my advantage, this isn't, because you're just going off of like, yeah, the effective physics of this fictional world.
Okay, so I was with you.
It's realism.
Yeah, well,
that's the thing.
It could be an unrealistic world, but it has its own like internal logic, right?
Sure. It's also a crap ton more DM prepping that I'm not prepared for because my players will not pay attention to anything that I put in front of them. They go straight for the MacGuffin, they kick down the door, and then they go, oops.
Yes, it takes a little bit of well, here's the thing. I feel like most of the times where I've run this with the online crowd, I come across a lot of people for whom this is new. This is a novel playstyle. And yes, there's some growing pains, like there's a learning curve. If you're accustomed to like the concept of balance encounters being a certain way, there's that like adjustment period. But for the most part, if it's not a lack of interest, and so it's not like they don't care. I imagine actually it could be a consequence of there being this rule of balanced encounters, and you really don't have to care. You don't have to pay attention to the things that Jim puts in front of you, because it doesn't matter ultimately. You're going to kick down the door, roll initiative, and deal with the thing in combat. That's the only time you really need to care. And so even if you do put clues in front of them, they're not like prompted them to think of those clues as vitally important, right? This isn't the kind of game where those clues are going to make or break whether or not they succeed, right? But in the simulationist game, it would be. If you don't pay attention, you TPK. And so there's greater incentive to pay attention.
So you have to kill a couple PCs to kind of like get their notice.
Example.
Like, set an example, kill a couple of them off, and like, okay, now that we all know what's going to happen every time you do that, now we can start playing the game. Is that we got to soften up a little bit, condition them?
What I found is if the players TPK and you point out like you had all these clues, you should have known better, and it rings true to them that you're right. I should have known better. Then they actually they don't complain that much. They actually accept it as like, yeah, I should have known better. I'll do better next time.
Way to be a bad player, dude.
I imagine, though, if you did the inverse, where you took a player exclusively familiar with simulationist gaming and you threw them into a gamist game, you would want to tear your hair out because there'd be a problem player. You'd do the same ogre scenario, right? They trek up the hill, they get to the cave, but before even getting to the fork in the road, they're gonna stop. They're gonna refuse to go in there, and they're gonna be like, "I'm not suicidally stupid. I don't want to go into a confined space with whatever creatures in there that could tear my head off as soon as look at me." And they're gonna waste like hours looking for footprints that aren't gonna be there because it's a quantum ogre, and then failing to find those, they're gonna waste even more time looking for canaries to their coal mine. Like, I don't know, find adventurers who are terminally ill, pay them exorbitant prices to their families for them to go in there and map the place in the hopes that one of them survives long enough to come back and tell them all that crap. They're going to waste multiple sessions refusing to go into this cave sight unseen. And all you wanted them to do was go in there, roll initiative, and fight the damn thing, right? And so you need to clarify which game you're playing to get the kind of behavior you're looking for from your players. And you need to reward it appropriately, too. It has to be rewarded that they paid attention. It has to pay off that they paid attention.
Yeah, I think there is a certain table that can appreciate this. As a forever DM, and I don't get to play any games ever, I don't think I would enjoy that. I am a gamist. I just want to roleplay my character, go get to that MacGuffin in the shortest way possible. Now, I do appreciate the level of detail and storytelling and environmentals and stuff like that. And I do tend to look for environmentals to help me with any sort of advantage, especially during like boss fights or, something like that too. So with all that, I guess I'm somewhere in the middle.
Wait, that didn't sound in the middle at all. You came down pretty hard on the gamist side.
Yeah, but I'm still looking at clue. Maybe I'm not understanding then. So, because I'm still looking at clues and stuff for to find weaknesses and any advantages that I could find that you're kind of sprinkling out, on the way up there.
Oh, I see what you mean. But what if that were the main challenge? That would be too much for you, I imagine. If you couldn't fight the ogre because it would kill you.
If it turned into a black and white scenario like that, yeah, I probably wouldn't have too much fun with that. Not my cup of tea.
That's fair.
But that's definitely like the old school players' cup of teas. Teas of cups? I don't know. What do you think, Keegan?
Teas of cups? I don't even know how to respond to something like I could see this. First coming into it as, okay, I can see that this is something different. But it seems like it's the devil in the details, because the more we talk about this, the more this sounds extraordinarily typical. Just heightened. Such as, well, knowing that that tree that is splintered should give you indication of the damage that could be done by this rock. Like, oh, cool. Well, if I'm game mastery as an experienced player playing a highly classical game, an adventure game, you could be like, well, that's probably like a 4d10 kind of thrown weapon, and I'm a newbie that only has 10 hit points. Well, that is a lethal moment for me. So you can have that game sense, but does it make it more real? Does it make it more believable? Does it make it more dangerous? Is it different at this point? Or are we just talking semantics because we like the terminology to describe our game more? Or are we just describing the exact same game that played at every single table across all the RPG multiverse?
We just covered that part, though, right? Like, because if you were to bring a player, say, that's familiar with the game's playstyle, and that's the game he thinks he's in, and you just didn't tell them anything because it's all the same, right? And you put them in the simulations game, they're just going to TPK, right? They're going to walk into that ogre encounter, TPK, and then call me out for being a terrible GM. And I would be, because if it was a game's game, I did screw the pooch. This is not a balanced encounter. And if it isn't, I screwed the pooch because I didn't tell them that it wasn't.
Okay, so the line right there almost sounds like balanced. It's one style. Not balanced, it's another style.
No. So here's the crux. It is balanced. It's just balanced in a different way, right? Like, the challenge isn't how to defeat the ogre in combat, right? That's not the challenge. It's how to defeat the ogre, given the how to defeat the ogre, period, and how to figure out how to defeat the ogre by, like, again, looking for footprints, clues, information. Work that out. So there is a balance here. There are clues and footprints for you to find. And it's relatively easy too, which is what I said. Like, even though this ogre will slaughter you in combat, the clues are so easy to find, and the ogre is such a dumb opponent that even though you can't outgun it, you can outsmart it very easily, right? And so this could be considered a balanced encounter, and an easy one at that. It's just a different kind of balance. It's a different kind of challenge than to defeat it in combat using game mechanics of, like, I get advantage if I flank or whatever it happens to be, right?
So what we could tell a new player that's never played, I am a newbie player, first day, you told me about this thing called RPG, sits at your table, and to explain it best is, it doesn't matter what your stats are on the paper. You can defeat the ancient dragon if you, the player, are smart enough to figure out how to get around it and find a weakness. Your stats just don't matter.
Well, they do, because ultimately the stats on your sheet determine what you can use your character to accomplish, right? Like, say the poison example. If you don't have a party member in your party that has a poison strong enough to kill an ogre, or can make a poison strong enough to kill an ogre, you don't have that option. It's not, even though there might be poisonous plants for you to distill and boil into a poisonous element, nobody knows how to do it, so that's not an option. Then you do something you can do, though, right? Like, so digging a hole isn't too difficult, doesn't require some specialized skill. So sharpening sticks to put at the bottom of that hole isn't too difficult, so you do that instead. Really, it's your creativity, ingenuity, and probably devious mind that sets the limits as to what you might come up with. Like, there's a rocky terrain here, you could cause a rock slide to bury it under rubble if you wanted to. That's another option. It's just up to what you can dream up and what kind of skill set the party has that can be deployed to aid in that task. But yes, the stats matter, but insofar as not necessarily in the numbers category. It's more like you can describe how it matters the way you describe somebody's like resume, right? Like, oh, this guy knows how to make poisons. How well he knows it is maybe not that important.
It can help you out. In the end, though, you say that it's not system specific. Is that true?
Well, I'm saying systems come after. First, you decide the playstyle, then you design a system to facilitate it.
So, like,
right? So
all the mini DMs out there that are playing D&D, they could do this right now.
Well, no, I it's been a minute since I looked at D&D, but I imagine D&D actually disincentivizes some of this stuff. So there probably isn't a poison that will outright kill an ogre, or traps that do enough damage to outright kill an ogre, because they don't want you to kill it this way. They want you to have the epic boss battle with the environmental hazards in the lair mechanics. That's what they want, and so it's encouraging
but a good DM like Knock. Are you saying that you've never rewarded your players for clever, like, ingenuity and decided, oh, sure, that pit with spiked wood, sure, that does enough damage to kill the ogre? Have you never, like, rewarded your players for their creativity?
I mean, yeah, I do that often.
And you have far more experience in that system than me. And if you're doing that often, so aren't we just rewarding ingenuity? Is that what's... Because why are we calling it a simulation when we're just rewarding ingenuity and making things unbalanced? Is simulation... Are we simulating ingenuity rewards and unbalanced environments?
Well, the simulationist playstyle, the naming convention is really there to denote where the challenge lies. And the challenge in that lies in paying attention to the world, the simulated world, right? And treating it as such. That is what you're doing actively as the player to overcome obstacles. In this case, like looking at what options you have for devious trap setting or something. And less so are you looking at like combat maneuvers that give you bonuses and penalties and these sorts of things. So it's not as focused on the game mechanics as it is on the fictional universe, right? And the rules within it and the opportunities that it presents you. And so that's why the simulationist moniker seems to fit that playstyle better, because that's what you're doing.
Yeah, all right.
So I will say that after everything we've talked about today, I like where you're going with this, because we have talked in other episodes, Keegan, about being descriptive, and I think that lends to the simulation playstyle. You have to be descriptive. You should be anyway. Any good storyteller is going to give the environments, right? You want to fully immerse the characters, and a lot of times they don't see the whole picture, and that's kind of our jobs as DMs, as GMs, to give those hints out and make them realize, like, yeah, you might be that level 1 character, and you rolled great. Maybe you rolled for your stats and you got a 17 in strength, 18 in strength, but you see that tree split in half and you're like, yeah, that's kind of, yeah, no matter how you slice it, metagame knowledge, that's 4d10 of damage, I only have 10 hit points, whatever. It doesn't matter. None of that, all that metadata doesn't matter. That character would go, this thing is really freaking big, or it's really freaking strong, I need to avoid it. The character would have that, no matter what their stats are, they would have that survival instinct on certain things. But again, leading back into the observations and the overall perceptions of maybe more subtle clues, that does come down to ingenuity. I think more of the player than the character. So I can see the blend, but I still think it's a good way of thinking. And honestly, I think every DM, every GM could take something away from that, if nothing else, to make their world more immersive, especially when you're looking at adventures and the journeys that it takes to get to that MacGuffin.
Can I riff off of that? Because I really love what you just said there. I actually think the simulationist playstyle is very, very good at generating immersion. But I suspect what most people imagine when they think immersion as related to role-playing games is how vividly can you picture the landscape and the space of your imagination. Can you feel the ocean breeze on your face? Can you almost smell the flowers and fauna, right? Like, they think that that's all immersion is, or mainly what immersion is. But traditionally, immersion just means that it consumes most of your thoughts, if not all of them, right? You're not thinking about, did I leave the stove on last night? Or like, oh, are there Cheetos left in the bowl? Those thoughts are vanishing because your mind is subsumed with thoughts about this fictional universe that you're in. And as you stack the number of things that you have to consider, right? Like the clues, what does it mean? What do they add up to? What opportunities does that present us? The more you give the players to think about that is related to this world, the less mental space they have to be pondering the stove at home or whatever it is, right? So it's actually quite good at facilitating that sense of immersion where you have to put a lot of your mind to work to navigate this simulated world, and that lends itself to that kind of immersion where you're just subsumed with thoughts about this place.
I can't think of a better poetic final thought than that. And so I think we're going to end it perfectly there. Once again, I am GM Keegan. Next to me, we have DM Knock, and across the table, joining us, is a veteran GM, Malfane. Thank you, and have a good night. Thank you, community, for listening. Join RollNet's Discord now to continue the discussion with other GMs, DMs, and players about tonight's topic. Come back next time, where there's always a seat waiting for you at a table in a tavern.
Oh, dear Lord, that's a rough place to start.